In the darkest days of World War II, when the Pacific Ocean burned with the fires of war and young men died by the thousands on beaches no one had ever heard of, the United States military made a decision that seemed completely insane. They took 40 men that society had thrown away, criminals and troublemakers who had broken every rule and crossed every line, and they sent them on a mission so dangerous that no one expected any of them to come back alive. These were not heroes in the traditional sense. These were not the kind of men you read about in newspapers or see marching in parades. These were thieves, brawlers, con artists, and rebels who had spent more time in military brigs than on actual battlefields. The military brass looked at these 40 misfits and saw something that no one else could see. They saw men who knew how to survive in the shadows, who understood that rules were meant to be broken when your life depended on it, and who possessed a kind of raw, untamed courage that could not be taught in any training manual. The mission they were given was simple in its description, but terrifying in its reality. Intelligence reports showed that approximately 30,000 Japanese soldiers were dug into a strategic position that conventional forces could not touch without losing thousands of American lives. The beaches were mined, the jungles were thick with enemy patrols, and every approach seemed like a pathway to certain death. So the military did something unprecedented. They decided to send in a small team to do what an entire division could not. They would go in quietly, strike hard, gather intelligence, and either complete objectives that would change the course of the war or die trying. No one gave them much chance of success, but what happened next would shock the entire military establishment and lay the foundation for the most elite fighting force the world has ever known. Before these 40 men became legends, they were nothing more than problems that the military did not know how to solve. In every war, there are soldiers who cannot fit into the normal structure of military life. They question orders, they break regulations, they fight with their superiors, and they end up in stockades and brigs waiting for courts-martial that will end their military careers in disgrace. Some of them had enlisted thinking war would be an adventure, only to discover that military life was mostly about following orders and staying in line. Others had been drafted against their will and resented every moment of their service. A few had criminal records even before they put on a uniform, and the judge had given them a choice between prison and the military. They chose the military, but they brought their criminal habits with them. There was a man from Chicago who had been arrested for armed robbery 3 times before he turned 18. There was a kid from Louisiana who had spent his teenage years running moonshine through the swamps and knew how to disappear into wilderness like a ghost. There was a former boxer from New York who had been dishonorably discharged twice for fighting with officers. There were farm boys who had never followed a rule in their lives, and city kids who had grown up stealing to survive. What they all had in common was that the normal military system had no use for them. They were considered liabilities, men who would get good soldiers killed through their recklessness and inability to follow orders. They were shuffled from unit to unit, always causing problems, always ending up in trouble. Some spent weeks at a time in military prisons, doing hard labor and counting the days until they could go home. But a few very smart people in military intelligence were watching these men and seeing something different. They saw that these troublemakers survived situations that killed regular soldiers. They saw that when things went wrong and orders broke down, these men knew how to think for themselves and adapt. They saw that the same qualities that made these men terrible regular soldiers might make them perfect for a different kind of warfare. Deep in the halls of military intelligence headquarters in Washington, a plan was taking shape that would have seemed like madness to anyone who heard about it. A small group of officers had been studying the war in the Pacific and had come to a troubling conclusion. The traditional tactics of sending waves of men against fortified positions were costing too many lives and taking too much time. The Japanese had proven to be fierce defenders who would rather die than surrender. And every island, every beach, every jungle stronghold required a massive commitment of men and resources to capture. The officers knew that America would eventually win through sheer industrial might and numerical superiority, but they also knew that thousands more young men would die in the process. They started thinking about a different approach. What if instead of sending thousands of men against a fortified position, they sent a handful of men who could strike from unexpected directions, gather intelligence, sabotage key installations, and create chaos behind enemy lines? The problem was that conventional soldiers were trained to fight in formations, to follow orders without question, and to operate within a clear chain of command. The kind of missions these officers were imagining required men who could think independently, who could survive in hostile territory without support, and who possessed a kind of raw, untamed courage that could not be taught in any training manual. The mission they were given was simple in its description, but terrifying in its reality. One by one, the 40 men were pulled out of their cells and brought before officers who made them an offer that seemed too good to be true. All charges would be dropped. All disciplinary actions would be erased from their records. They would be given a chance to serve their country in a way that actually mattered. But there was a catch, and it was a big one. They would be volunteering for a mission so dangerous that the survival rate was estimated at less than 10%. They would receive special training unlike anything in the regular military. They would learn skills that were not in any official manual. And if they succeeded, they would be doing something that could change the course of the war. If they failed, they would most likely die. And because the mission was classified, no one would ever know what they had tried to do. The men were given 24 hours to decide. Some thought it was a trick or a test. Some figured they were going to die in prison anyway, so they might as well die doing something that mattered. Some saw it as a chance to redeem themselves and prove that they were more than the screw-ups everyone thought they were. A few saw it as the greatest adventure they would ever have. When the 24 hours were up, all 40 men had volunteered. They were immediately shipped to a remote training facility that did not appear on any official maps. The location was chosen because it had terrain similar to what they would face in the Pacific: thick jungle, steep hills, swamps, and beaches. The training they received was unlike anything the military had ever done before. There were no parade drills, no inspections, no spit and polish. Instead, they learned how to kill silently with knives and their bare hands. They learned how to move through jungle without making a sound. They learned how to survive for weeks with almost no supplies. They learned demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, navigation by stars, and dozens of other skills that would keep them alive in enemy territory. But more than skills, they learned to work as a team in a way they had never done before. These men who had spent their lives as lone wolves and troublemakers discovered that their survival depended on trusting the men beside them. The training facility was run by a group of officers who understood that conventional methods would not work with these men. You could not yell at them and expect them to snap to attention. You could not threaten them with punishment because they had already been through the worst the military could throw at them. Instead, the instructors treated them with a kind of rough respect. They acknowledged that these men were different, and that different was exactly what this mission needed. The training was brutal beyond anything they had experienced. They were dropped in the jungle with no food and told to survive for a week. They were forced to swim miles in the open ocean with full gear. They practiced beach landings in the middle of the night, crawling through mud and barbed wire while instructors fired live ammunition over their heads. They learned how to build explosives from common materials and how to sabotage everything from bridges to fuel depots. They were taught how to interrogate prisoners, how to read maps in the dark, and how to communicate with hand signals when silence was the difference between life and death. The instructors pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed before, and surprisingly, the men responded. For the first time in their lives, many of these troublemakers felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. They started to develop a fierce pride in what they were becoming. The Chicago criminal who had spent half his life in and out of jail discovered he had a natural talent for demolitions. The moonshine runner from Louisiana became the best scout in the group, able to move through jungle like he was invisible. The boxer from New York turned out to be a natural leader, and men who would not take orders from regular officers followed him without question. As the weeks turned into months, something remarkable happened. These 40 criminals and misfits transformed into a cohesive fighting unit that could do things no regular military unit could do. They developed their own tactics, their own signals, their own way of operating that was part military discipline and part street smarts. The officers watching the training were amazed at what they were seeing. These men were creating a new kind of warfare right before their eyes. While the 40 men were training, military intelligence was gathering information about the target that would determine whether this experimental unit would ever be used in combat. The target was an island in the Pacific that held strategic importance far beyond its small size. Japanese forces had turned it into a fortress with thousands of troops, extensive fortifications, and supply depots that supported enemy operations across an entire region. Traditional military planning called for a massive invasion that would require tens of thousands of American troops and would likely result in casualties numbering in the thousands. Worse, the invasion would take weeks or even months, during which time the Japanese could reinforce the position or destroy vital intelligence before retreating. But intelligence officers had discovered something that changed the equation. Hidden in the center of the island was a Japanese command center that contained maps, code books, and strategic plans that could provide invaluable information about enemy positions throughout the Pacific. If those documents could be captured intact, they would give American forces a massive advantage in future operations. The problem was that conventional forces could never reach the command center before the Japanese destroyed everything. Even if American troops managed to fight their way across the beaches and through the jungle, the enemy would have plenty of warning to burn all the documents and kill anyone who knew important information. What was needed was a small team that could infiltrate the island undetected, reach the command center before the Japanese knew they were there, secure the intelligence, and either extract it or transmit the information before enemy reinforcements arrived. The mission profile was brought to the officers overseeing the experimental unit of 40 former criminals. This was exactly the kind of mission they had been training for. The decision was made to proceed, but even the most optimistic officers gave the mission no more than a 20% chance of success. The plan was refined over dozens of meetings. The 40 men would approach the island at night in small boats, landing at a point where intelligence suggested the beach was less heavily defended. They would move inland through the jungle, avoiding enemy patrols and reaching the command center in the pre-dawn hours when Japanese soldiers would be least alert. They would assault the command center, secure the intelligence, and hold the position until extraction forces could reach them. If extraction proved impossible, they were to transmit as much information as possible by radio and then fight their way to a secondary extraction point on the opposite side of the island. On paper, it sounded difficult but feasible. In reality, everyone knew it was a suicide mission. The 40 men were brought together for a final briefing 3 days before the mission was scheduled to launch. For the first time, they learned the full details of what they were being asked to do. Maps were spread out showing the island, the estimated positions of 30,000 Japanese troops, the location of the command center, and the routes they would take. Intelligence officers explained what documents they were looking for and what information was most critical. Communication specialists explained how the radio equipment worked and what frequencies to use. Medical staff gave them emergency supplies and showed them how to treat wounds in the field. Weapons experts made sure every man had the guns, knives, and explosives they needed. The mood in the room was strange. These men had spent months training for a mission without knowing the details, and now that they knew, the reality of what they were facing settled over them like a heavy blanket. A few men made jokes to break the tension. Others sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts. Some wrote letters home, even though they were not supposed to tell anyone where they were going or what they were doing. The commanding officer, who had overseen their training, spoke to them one last time. He did not give them a patriotic speech about duty and honor. Instead, he told them the truth. He said that what they were being asked to do was nearly impossible, and that most of them would probably not come back. He said that the military was asking them to do this because conventional forces could not, and because the intelligence they might capture could save thousands of American lives. He said that every man in that room had been written off as worthless by society at one point, but that they now had a chance to prove everyone wrong. He said that if they succeeded, they would be heroes, even if the world never knew their names. And if they failed, they would die knowing they had tried to do something that mattered. Then he asked if any man wanted to back out. Not a single man moved. The night before they shipped out, the 40 men were given shore leave in a small town near the training facility. Some got drunk and picked fights with regular soldiers who looked down on them. Some found quiet corners to sit alone and think about their lives. A few visited churches they had not been inside since childhood and said prayers they were not sure anyone was listening to. They all knew this might be the last normal night they ever had. The departure happened in the dead of night, with no fanfare and no witnesses. The 40 men were loaded onto a submarine that would take them to a point 15 miles off the coast of the target island. From there, they would use small rubber boats to make the final approach, paddling silently through dark waters while trying not to think about what waited for them on the beach. The submarine ride took 3 days, and the men spent the time in cramped quarters checking and rechecking their equipment, going over the mission plan in their heads, and trying to ignore the knot of fear in their stomachs. On the third night, the submarine surfaced under cover of darkness. The sea was rougher than they had hoped, with waves that made the small rubber boats difficult to control. The men climbed out of the submarine and into the boats, 4 or 5 men per boat, along with their weapons and equipment packed in waterproof bags. The submarine disappeared beneath the waves, and suddenly the 40 men were alone in the middle of the ocean, with nothing but darkness around them and an island full of enemy soldiers ahead. They paddled in silence, using techniques they had practiced hundreds of times in training. The boats stayed close together, but not so close that a single enemy machine gun could hit multiple boats at once. Every man scanned the darkness for any sign of enemy patrol boats or aircraft. The sound of waves against the rubber boat seemed impossibly loud, and every splash of a paddle felt like it would give away their position. Hours passed as they paddled through the darkness. Arms burned with fatigue, and hands became numb from gripping the paddles. Salt spray stung their eyes, and the weight of their gear made every movement difficult. But they kept going because turning back was not an option, and stopping meant drifting off course. Finally, through the darkness, they saw the shadow of land ahead. The beach was a thin line of lighter darkness against the black mass of jungle behind it. This was the moment of greatest danger. If Japanese sentries spotted them now, they would be cut down in the water with no cover and no chance to fight back. The boats moved even more slowly now, each man barely breathing as they approached the beach. They could hear the sound of waves breaking on sand. They could smell the jungle, a thick mix of vegetation and moisture that was different from anything they had smelled before. 50 yards from the beach, they stopped paddling and let the waves carry them forward. 30 yards, 20 yards, 10 yards. The bottom of the boat scraped against sand, and in an instant the men were out and pulling the boats up the beach into the cover of the jungle. They crouched in the darkness, weapons ready, every sense alert for any sign that they had been spotted. Seconds passed like hours. No alarm was raised, no shots were fired. They had made it onto the island undetected. The easy part was over. The jungle was even worse than they had imagined during training. The darkness under the canopy was absolute, and they had to navigate by feel as much as by sight, using the faint luminescence of compasses and the stars visible through gaps in the trees. Every step was a test of nerve. The ground was uneven, covered with roots and vines that caught at their feet. Thick vegetation brushed against them from all sides, and they had to move slowly to avoid making noise that would alert enemy patrols. Strange sounds came from the darkness around them, insects and animals they could not identify, and every sound made them freeze and listen to make sure that it was not a Japanese soldier moving through the jungle toward them. They had memorized the route during the briefing, and the point man led them using nothing but a compass and an instinct developed during months of training. They moved in single file, each man keeping one hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him so they would not get separated in the darkness. Every 15 minutes they stopped and listened, waiting to hear any sign of enemy activity. The island was crawling with Japanese troops, and intelligence had warned them that patrols moved through the jungle at all hours. Twice during the first hour they heard voices in the darkness and had to freeze in place, barely breathing while Japanese soldiers passed within yards of their position. The enemy troops were talking casually, not expecting any threat, and they walked right past the 40 Americans without knowing they were there. Once the voices faded, the team continued moving, knowing that their luck could not hold forever. The jungle seemed to go on forever. What looked like a few miles on a map turned into an exhausting journey that took hours of careful movement. Sweat soaked through their uniforms and mosquitoes swarmed around them in clouds. They could not slap at the insects because the sound might give them away, so they endured the bites and kept moving. Some men started to wonder if they had gotten lost, if the point man had made a mistake and they were wandering in circles while the night slipped away. But then, just as doubt was setting in, they saw lights through the trees ahead. They had reached the command center. The command center was larger and more heavily defended than the intelligence reports had suggested. It was not just a single building but a compound of several structures surrounded by a fence with guard towers at each corner. Lights illuminated the area around the buildings, and they could see Japanese soldiers moving between structures. From their position in the jungle, the 40 men studied the compound and realized that the mission plan they had practiced would have to change. The original plan called for a quick assault through the main gate, but they could see now that the gate was too heavily defended. There were at least 20 soldiers visible, with more certainly inside the buildings. The guard towers were manned with machine guns that could cut down anyone trying to approach across the open ground. They pulled back deeper into the jungle to discuss their options. The boxer from New York, who had become the unofficial leader, gathered the men in a tight circle. They spoke in whispers so quiet that men had to press their ears almost against the speaker's lips to hear. The decision was made to split into 3 teams. One team would circle around to the far side of the compound and create a diversion, drawing the guards and soldiers away from the main buildings. A second team would use the chaos to breach the fence on the opposite side and assault the command building where intelligence believed the critical documents were kept. The third team would remain in the jungle as a reserve, ready to provide covering fire or reinforce either team if things went wrong. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only chance they had. The teams separated and began moving into position. The diversion team had the most dangerous job. The first explosion shattered the night silence with a blast that seemed impossibly loud after hours of moving in near total quiet. The diversion team had placed demolition charges against a fuel storage building on the far side of the compound, and when those charges detonated, a fireball erupted into the sky that could probably be seen for miles. Instantly, chaos erupted throughout the compound. Japanese soldiers poured out of buildings, shouting and running toward the fire. The guards in the towers turned their attention to the flames, trying to see what had happened. Officers barked orders and men scrambled to organize a response to what they assumed was either an accident or perhaps sabotage by local resistance fighters. While the compound's defenders focused on the fire, the assault team moved. They sprinted the final 50 yards to the fence with bolt cutters in hand. The fence was chain link, topped with barbed wire, and they worked frantically to cut a hole large enough for men to slip through. Behind them, the diversion team opened fire on the compound, rifles and machine guns creating more confusion and drawing even more soldiers away from the command building. The assault team burst through the fence and ran across open ground toward the command building. They were halfway there when a Japanese sentry saw them and opened fire. Bullets kicked up dirt at their feet, and the men scattered, diving for whatever cover they could find. The reserve team in the jungle immediately engaged, their fire cutting down the sentry and several other soldiers who appeared from around buildings. Now the entire compound knew they were under attack, and the situation devolved into a savage firefight. The assault team reached the command building and placed explosive charges on the door. The blast blew the door off its hinges, and men rushed inside with weapons ready. They found themselves in a hallway with multiple doors. They kicked in doors one after another, clearing rooms, looking for the documents that were the whole purpose of this insane mission. Most rooms were empty or contained nothing but furniture and equipment. Then they found it, a large room filled with maps on the walls, filing cabinets, and tables covered with papers. This was what they had come for. While half the team secured the entrances and windows, firing at Japanese soldiers who were trying to reach the building, the other half began grabbing everything that looked important. They stuffed documents into bags, ripped maps off walls, and grabbed code books and files from cabinets. Outside, the fighting was intensifying. More and more Japanese soldiers were converging on the command building, and the small team of Americans was in danger of being overrun. The situation was deteriorating by the second. What had started as a controlled assault was turning into a desperate battle for survival. Japanese soldiers were firing from multiple directions, and the Americans in the command building were pinned down. The diversion team had done their job too well, and now hundreds of enemy troops were flooding toward the sound of gunfire. Bullets slammed into the walls of the command building, smashing through windows and splintering wood. The men inside fired back through the windows, trying to keep the enemy at bay while the document collection continued. The radio operator managed to set up his equipment in one corner of the room and began transmitting the first batch of information back to American forces. He shouted out coordinates and unit designations from the captured documents, while explosions and gunfire echoed around him. Outside, the reserve team was in full engagement, their machine guns cutting down Japanese soldiers who tried to approach the building. But ammunition was running low, and they all knew they could not hold this position for long. The boxer from New York made the decision to begin extraction. He shouted orders over the chaos, and the men in the command building grabbed the last of the documents and prepared to move. The plan had been to extract the same way they came in, back through the jungle to the beach where boats would pick them up. But that was no longer possible. Enemy troops blocked that route, and more were arriving every minute. They would have to fight their way to the secondary extraction point on the opposite side of the island, a journey of several miles through territory that was now fully alerted to their presence. The assault team burst out of the command building in a flying wedge formation, laying down heavy fire as they ran toward the fence. Men fell, some wounded, some killed instantly, but the others kept moving because stopping meant death. They reached the fence and pulled and pushed each other through the gap they had cut earlier. The reserve team provided covering fire until the assault team was clear. Then they pulled back into the jungle themselves. The diversion team had the hardest time extracting because they were furthest from the rally point and surrounded by angry Japanese troops. They fought a running battle through the compound and into the jungle, using every trick they had learned in training. They set booby traps behind them using grenades with the pins pulled and held in place by rocks that would shift when someone walked past. They used smoke screens and noise diversions. They split up and reunited to confuse pursuers. Somehow, most of them made it into the jungle alive. The jungle that had been their ally during the approach now became a nightmare obstacle course as they tried to move quickly through terrain that was designed to slow you down. Behind them, they could hear the Japanese organizing pursuit parties with dogs and lights. The enemy knew that Americans were on the island and every soldier would be mobilized to hunt them down before they could escape. The 40 men, now reduced to about 30 after casualties in the compound, moved as fast as they dared through the darkness. They could not use lights because that would give away their position, so they stumbled over roots, crashed through vegetation, and occasionally ran straight into trees. Men helped each other up when someone fell. They shared the load when someone's strength began to fail. The bags full of captured documents were heavy and awkward to carry, but no one suggested leaving them behind because they all knew that men had died to get those documents. The radio operator tried to keep his equipment working while moving through the jungle, but it was nearly impossible. Every impact against a tree or stumble over a root threatened to damage the delicate vacuum tubes and wiring. He transmitted in short bursts whenever they stopped to catch their breath, sending coordinates and troop information back to command. Each transmission risked giving away their position, but getting the intelligence out was the mission, and the mission came first. As dawn began to lighten the sky, their situation became even more desperate. Daylight would make them visible to enemy aircraft and easier for ground troops to track. They needed to reach the secondary extraction point before full daylight, or they would be caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The point man pushed them harder, navigating by instinct and the occasional glimpse of landmarks through the trees. They climbed steep hills that left them gasping for breath. They waded through swamps where the water came up to their chests and they had to hold their weapons above their heads. They crossed streams by balancing on slippery rocks, and more than one man fell in, soaking equipment and documents. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. The Japanese were getting closer. They could hear shouting in Japanese and the barking of dogs. Several times they had to detour around enemy patrols that had positioned themselves across the route to the beach. Once they found themselves trapped between two converging groups of Japanese soldiers and had to hide in a dense thicket while the enemy passed on either side, so close they could have reached out and touched them. The captured documents began to disintegrate from moisture and rough handling, so men transferred the information to their own notebooks, writing down key details even as they moved through the jungle. If the documents were lost, at least some of the intelligence might survive in those hastily scribbled notes. They reached the secondary extraction point just as full daylight broke across the island. The beach was not the quiet, empty stretch they had hoped for. Japanese patrols were visible in both directions, and enemy positions on the hills overlooking the beach had clear sight lines across the sand and water. The extraction plan called for American boats to approach the beach at dawn, but getting to those boats would mean crossing 200 yards of open sand under enemy fire. The boxer from New York gathered the remaining men and explained what they were going to do. They would split into two groups. The first group would make a run for the water, while the second group provided covering fire from the jungle. Once the first group reached the boats, they would provide covering fire while the second group made their run. It was simple, brutal, and their only chance. They could see the American boats in the distance, 3 patrol boats waiting just beyond the range of accurate enemy fire. The boats had been circling the area since before dawn, waiting for any sign of the team. When the first group broke from the jungle and ran toward the water, the crews on those boats knew immediately what was happening. The first group ran with everything they had left. Men who had been awake for more than 24 hours, who had fought through a compound full of enemy soldiers, who had trekked for miles through hostile jungle, somehow found the strength to sprint across that open beach. Japanese soldiers on the hills opened fire immediately. Bullets kicked up sand all around the running Americans. Men fell, hit by enemy fire, or simply collapsing from exhaustion. The others kept running, knowing that stopping meant death. The second group fired from the jungle, aiming at muzzle flashes on the hills, trying to suppress the enemy fire enough to give their comrades a chance. The patrol boats opened up with their deck guns, firing explosive shells at the Japanese positions. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar of gunfire and explosions that drowned out even the sound of the surf. The first men reached the water and dove in, swimming through the waves toward the boats. Sailors on the boats threw lines and pulled exhausted soldiers aboard. As soon as the first group was clear, the second group made their run. The pattern repeated, men running, men falling, men swimming through the surf while bullets splashed in the water around them. The patrol boats moved closer to shore, their guns blazing at the enemy positions. One boat took hits and started trailing smoke, but kept up its fire. The last man to leave the beach was the radio operator. He had stayed in the jungle until the very end, transmitting intelligence even as bullets cut through the trees around him. When his radio finally took a hit and went dead, he grabbed the last bag of documents, slung it over his shoulder, and ran. He made it halfway across the beach before enemy fire cut him down. He fell face first in the sand, the bag of documents flying from his hands. Without hesitation, the moonshine runner from Louisiana, who had already made it to the water, turned around and ran back up the beach. He grabbed the bag of documents and the wounded radio operator and dragged them both toward the water while bullets kicked up sand all around him. How he was not hit remains a mystery. He reached the surf and other men came out to help him pull the radio operator into the water and toward the boats. The patrol boats pulled away from the beach at full speed, while Japanese artillery began to find their range. Shells exploded in the water, sending up massive geysers that rocked the boats. The sailors pushed their engines to the maximum, and slowly the beach fell away behind them. Japanese aircraft appeared overhead, but American fighters that had been circling at high altitude dove down to intercept them. A fierce dogfight erupted above the boats while they raced for open water. On the decks of the patrol boats, medics worked frantically on the wounded. Of the 40 men who had landed on the island the night before, only 27 made it off. 13 were dead or missing, left behind in the jungle or on the beach. Nearly everyone who survived was wounded in some way, some seriously. Blood mixed with seawater on the decks, and the smell of cordite and salt filled the air.